Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year.
Welcome to our fourth lecture of the season, and our first for 2014 comes on the second Wednesday. Hope I didn't confuse too many. For those of you here for the first time, First Wednesday is a program of the Vermont Humanities Council. It takes place the first Wednesday of each month, October through May, in 9 libraries across the state. So at any rate, as I was saying, we have a brochure which has all of the lectures for the rest of the year. And it also has the talks going on at the other 8 sites. So if you see a talk in that brochure that you might like to have in Brattleboro, put it down on the feedback form and give it to me, and I'll use that when we're planning our next year's talks. Even though admission is free tonight, it's not free to the library. We have to come up with $2,500 every year for these talks. So if you're not a member of the Friends of the Library, which is the main sponsor of these events, please become one, because that will help us come up with the cash to do the series. And we do have other sponsors and funders. They are Brattleboro Savings and Loan, the Vermont Country Store, Downs Racklin Martin, LLC, the Wyndham World Affairs Council of Vermont, and New Chapter, Inc. And I'd also like to make a special recognition for the Vermont Department of Libraries, who is the series sponsor. I'd like to thank Mary I, the Friends president. You saw she did this nice PowerPoint of our sponsors before our speaker tonight, so I'd like to thank her and all the work that she does. Next month's lecture is going to be February 5th, and it will host composer and pianist Ignat Solzhenitsyn, who will be speaking on his father's painstaking crafting of the Red Will, history of the Russian Revolution, and his family life in Cavendish in the 1980s. If you've been in Vermont for 20, 25 years, you'll probably remember that Alexander Solzhenitsyn came here and spent his latter years here in Vermont. And if you want to read some of Solzhenitsyn's works, we're hosting a 3-part reading discussion series that starts tomorrow at 4 p.m. up in the meeting room. One day in the life of Ivan Denisovich will be discussed. We have copies of the book, so if you want to cram tonight and read it, or you may have read it when it first came out, so please come to the talk tomorrow. It'll be a facilitated talk with Richard Wazansky, who is our humanities scholar. And then the next reading will be January 16th, and that will be Matryona's Home, a novella by Solzhenitsyn. And then February 23rd will be 2 lectures that he gave, the Nobel Prize lecture when he received the prize, and then he gave a lecture to the Harvard graduating class, I think of 1978, and that will also be part of the reading. So please come, we have copies of all those. And now on to our speaker. On the 50th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty speech, I think it is so appropriate that we have Professor Orleck back in Brattleboro. She was here in November of 2011 to speak about the 100 years since the tragic and devastating Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. So I'm very happy to have her back again. Dr. Orleck is a professor of history at Dartmouth College, where she teaches U.S. political history, women's history, and the history of race, ethnicity, and immigration, as well as Jewish studies. She's author of Common Sense and A Little Fire, Women and Working Class Politics in the United States, and Storming Caesar's Palace, How Black Mothers Fought Their Own War on Poverty, 2005, and that's what she'll be talking on tonight. And the co-editor of Politics of Motherhood, Activist Voices from Left to Right. And we have copies of some of her books tonight that Everyone's Books is going to sell. And I'm sure Dr. Orleck will sign as well. So please welcome Dr. Annelise Orleck.
Thanks for your patience. I feel like I've got all these mics and things all over me, so I'll try to relax. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, excellent. Yeah, when we originally planned this date, I had somehow lost track of the fact that it was the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's declaration of war on poverty, and I played some clips from that for my students today. I really strongly urge you to go on YouTube and play it, because when my students hear his call, their jaws literally drop, because the way he speaks about poverty and moral imperatives and his insistence on doing something about a moral wrong sounds very different from what's considered politically possible today. And I think Lyndon Johnson really is kind of the classic example of the president who manages to do so much good and so much evil in the same administration. But I think too often, because it was so horrifying, the war in Vietnam overshadows what happened in the war on poverty. And I just want to urge you to go back. I've been talking to reporters today, and what many of them have said to me is, I've never heard anyone say it succeeded. All I've ever heard is that it failed, and it failed miserably, to use Paul Ryan's words. Well, what I'd like to do is two things tonight. One is tell you some focused stories on a group of women in Las Vegas and some of their co-activists in New York who made those poverty programs really work for their communities, who were able, in pulling in money for these poverty programs, to bring some truth to their slogan that we can do it and do it better, that poor women are the real experts on poverty, and that these social service programs not only can deliver vitally needed services, medical care, housing, education, health, and cultural services to communities that desperately need them, but also they can provide jobs for people in chronically unemployed areas at the same time. So I'll tell you the story of these women in Las Vegas and New York, and then maybe what we can do on the 50th anniversary of the war on poverty is talk about whether or not this is a model, whether it can still be used, whether it is a possible approach to poverty today, at a time when just a few weeks ago they published a study that showed that something like 49 million Americans they're not quite food insecure, but they're not secure about having food on their table every day. And as I was just listening to the radio as I came in on Marketplace, they said, the word politicians are so reluctant to use the word poverty now that it's almost lost its meaning. So I think it's a really good moment for us to start thinking about saying the P word and using it all the time, and thinking about creative approaches. So what if poor women ruled the world? Okay. So the poor women that I'm going to tell you about most of them began their journey in the Mississippi Delta as the last sharecroppers. This is Ruby Duncan, who would become the leader of the Las Vegas movement, really quite remarkable woman. She's 17 years old here. It's the Tallulah County Fair in 1949, and this is the first photograph ever taken of her, because her family certainly did not have anything as luxurious as a camera. She was born on something called the Ivory Plantation, and in the 1930s and 40s, the Ivory Plantation still had a big house. Sharecroppers still lived in former slave cottages, and there was was Mr. Johnny and Little Johnny who ran the plantation, and she was desperate to get off that plantation, stop picking cotton. There's a number of other women I'll tell you about who were part of this migration to Las Vegas and who I was privileged to spend about a dozen years with in the 90s and early 2000s as I learned about the movement that they built, along with Ruby Duncan, Elversa Beals, Emma Stampley, Mary Wesley, Rosie Seals. And I want to give you their names because poor, single, black welfare mothers became such a demonized category in our country in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, that they weren't usually spoken about with names, right? They were kind of othered and made almost the next enemy. Between the communists and the terrorists came, single welfare moms. So I'm naming them, tell you a little bit about their story. Duncan's friend, Versie Beals, could pick, she said, by the time she was a teenager, 200-300 pounds a day. Ruby was always getting herself beaten because she said she could never do more than 50. It wasn't meant for her as a life. And she was getting caught doing things like laying down and going to sleep in the cotton fields just to take a break as a rebellious. That was her rebellion as a teenager. That resulted in beatings and many other things. So when I asked Alversa Biels, I said, God, sounds like slavery. Did it feel like slavery? She laughed at me. She said, no, it didn't feel like slavery. It was slavery. And so I want you to try to take our minds back, to the 1940s and 50s and understand that this life was still being lived, that these women were living lives that were really more akin to those of their enslaved grandmothers than to the lives of modern Americans after World War II. And they decided they wanted something better, and they migrated. And when I talk about the chain migration from the Mississippi Delta to Las Vegas, multiply it to many cities, right? There are chain migrations to Chicago. There are chain migrations from other towns to Detroit. There are chain migrations to certain neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And it's black and white people who came out of the South to these cities and towns across the United States in the 1950s and 60s, upwards of 5 million people. And here's a few more. Here's Emma Stampley in Vicksburg, Mississippi, quite a bit later, 66. She migrated late. And Emma had a problem. She didn't get out early enough, and she lived in Mississippi at a time when poor black women could not get birth control. They couldn't because, as one doctor said in that same year when Robert Kennedy came down to the Delta to investigate, said, if a black woman doesn't have a baby every year from the time she's 12, then it's a waste. We're still operating on this plantation economy, right, on this idea of creating as many people as you can to pick in the fields. So she was done. She got out of the cotton fields, left. At a certain point, her husband was abusive. She left him, and she decided she was going to support her kids some other way than picking cotton. And she got a job in the lumber mill, the only woman in the mill. Lumber mills were, the first option before people went to the cities and left the South. They often went to, to smaller towns, bigger towns than they were on. She went to Vicksburg, famous site of Civil War battlefield and home of a lumber mill, and that way supported her 8 children and continued to beg every doctor that she could find for birth control. Now, why do I talk to you about all this work? Because what's the first myth? What's the first thing that's always said about single moms on welfare?
They don't work.
Yeah, they don't work. They're so lazy. What did one of our gubernatorial candidates say, Ruth Dwyer, that they like to stay? They basically leave their kids home with a box of Cheerios while they're out cavorting with their boyfriends. So what I wanted you to think about is the history of these women's work lives, because their work lives were intense. And when they went to Las Vegas, this particular group of women in the 40s, and they went to work in Henderson, Nevada, in the desert in munitions plant, right? Making magnesium-based munitions for the military in World War II. The thing is, the Army was still segregated, and the areas the dormitories that there were for white migrants to work in the plants weren't available to black workers. And so some of them were sleeping in the desert, sleeping in caves. The ones who were better off were in Las Vegas. So this is 1942. Right? People living in shacks, living in chicken coops, serving our country. They've gone there for a better life. Okay, but here's the really shocking thing. That's the 60s. That's the same time as Sammy Davis Jr. and Frank Sinatra and all those folks, the Rat Pack, glamorous Las Vegas, the Strip. Okay, that's how the people who were working in some of these strip hotels were living, in what they called the neon shadow. So some surveys, part of what happened was that when all these Southerners, and it was black and white both, I think the towns had negative reactions to when they came out of the South, but it was particularly black migrants. And so most cities adopted a strategy of not giving them any services in the hope that they would just leave. But as Arne Bontemps, the great Harlem Renaissance writer, said, he wrote this book called They Seek a City, and he talks about the incredible disappointment of the Louisiana migrant when they've traveled days and days and days, really wanting to leave the South behind, and they get to, as he put it, the ridiculous neighborhoods on the outskirts of cities all across the United States where black migrants were living, and his character says, oh, this is where they keep the colored people, I should have known. When these women got there, when Rosie Seals got there from Sunhammer, Louisiana, she looked around and she said, where's the houses? She said, oh, it was chicken coops, all as far as I could see. Just chicken coops. And people were literally living in chicken coops with rugs under the door to keep out the desert winds. Now, something to remember also is that these chicken coops and these houses they were living in were not only exposed to desert elements, heat and rain and dust and all the things that existed in the natural climate of Las Vegas once you got off the strip. They also were living downwind of above-ground nuclear tests, which didn't stop until 1962. So those who came in the 40s and 50s were also regularly being rained on by fallout. All that being so, all that being true, here's some more conditions on the Black West Side. Someone's living in that car. And there's, a little trailer and outhouse, 1960s, Vegas. All that being so, they found something in Vegas that they hadn't experienced before, and that was trade unions. Because the mob had made some very good deals with the unions in founding Vegas. They didn't want to stop the flow of cash. So it was unionized business working in those hotels. And it was also decently paid wages for the men who worked out at the nuclear test site. It was because it was government owned by the 1950s, government run by the 1950s. Black people could get jobs there. They were, sort of promoted along the same lines as whites. And so for all of this hard stuff, Vegas seemed worth it. And for these women, it was really a remarkable thing. Ruby Duncan remembered working in one of the big strip hotels. I think it was the Sands. And at the end of her shift, she, by this point, is a single mother of, I don't know how many kids, 7 kids. And she was about to meet her husband who would take care of them. But in any case, she's told she has to suddenly work at night. And she said, I can't work at night. I've got my kids. I've got to go home. And the housekeeper said, well, then you're fired. And Duncan said the experience of being able to go to her business agent, who was another black migrant woman from the South, and have the business agent come back and negotiate with management and get her reinstated and say, look, here's the contract. This is what you guys have agreed to. Duncan said it was revelatory. And the way she described it is, slavery is finally over. So being involved in a labor union is really powerful for them in a whole variety of ways. They're working together with, with white women. They're working together with black and white men. Right? And so it's an integrated environment for the first time in their lives. And it is an environment where they have some rights. All that said, again, these are women who had worked way too hard physically in their youth. They're still being worked too hard in the hotels. And there's still discrimination about what kinds of jobs they can get in the hotels. The front of the house jobs, right? The cocktail waitresses and the dealers and all the jobs that really made good money and didn't have the same kind of physical labor were all held by white people. Black women couldn't get those jobs. Mexican women couldn't get those jobs. And the jobs started to wear them down, and sometimes they got hurt. Okay, so second myth of welfare mothers that I didn't stop and talk about, right, but they just have all those babies to get more money. These women were begging for birth control, begged for it in the Delta, couldn't get it, begged for it in Las Vegas and couldn't get it for another reason. They couldn't get it because the only hospital in town that they could go to was a Catholic hospital, and they just wouldn't give it to them. And so these women tell these amazing stories of when Duncan had her 7th child, she literally tied herself to the bed in the hospital, said, I'm not leaving until you tie my tubes. I'm not going. Versie Beals has a similar description of just literally refusing to leave her doctor's office, just laying herself down on the floor. And so they're fighting for birth control. They're fighting for some decent conditions. With all these kids, with all the terrible physical labor they did as kids, with the malnutrition, with everything they faced, many of them got injured. Duncan was carrying a giant pot of hot water with vegetables in it from the kitchen of one of the Vegas hotels, and she slipped on a patch of grease and landed on her coccyx, which is causing her pain to this day. She's 80 now. And she was almost paralyzed. Other women described getting gum diseases, gum infections that landed them in the hospital. And ultimately, one of the things that happened is that the welfare state in Vegas, in Nevada, worked together with the casino industry. They were one of the last states in the union to bring in any kind of aid to the poor. But it was convenient when you wanted to lay people off from work for a little while to be able to help them get on public assistance. That still happens in seasonal industries all over the country. People who it works to the benefit of employers far more than to the benefit of the workers who have to live on it, and it's never quite enough to live on. Anyway, these women were on public assistance in 1970 when the state administrator in Las Vegas, a guy by the name of George Miller, returned from a conference in California where he was really impressed by his work with former Governor Ronald Reagan. And it was Reagan's argument that if you had a few test cases of states that were able to cut significant numbers of people off the rolls, test cases in states like Nevada, where it wasn't so many, you could actually, investigate everybody and try to root out fraud. And, if you had a test case there, that maybe you could then take that model and apply it to New York, Illinois, and California, the three states that together had 40% of all the people on public assistance in the country. So that's what he does. In January of 1971, he he cuts a third of families off the rolls, period. He cuts the benefits of another third because he claims they're working, and as one woman said, of course we're working. No one could live on what they were being paid. It was $144 a month for a family of four. Even in 1971, you couldn't live on that. And so they're cut off, and 1/3 he slightly raises their checks because they're the deserving poor, supposedly. And so these women decide to fight back. Now, here's a little side. I'm going to go back a little bit to Bobby Kennedy in New York in 1966, because this will be very important to this idea that I want to talk about these programs that poor women would run. Bobby Kennedy, then senator from New York, goes on a tour of Bedford-Stuyvesant, the huge black ghetto in Brooklyn, and a neighborhood that also had some nice solid housing and middle-class people and activists. And he said, we need business. We need something. There are blocks and blocks of emptiness and no services. And so Kennedy formulates legislation for something called community economic development corporations, which try to bring public and private together. And that's another model that we can talk about today. It's very viable today. There are still something like 1,100 of these around the country. And so he passes amendments to Johnson's Economic Opportunity Act to create the community development corporations. And when you begin to get a welfare rights movement in the country, they become interested in having poor women run some of these corporations that are going to try to bring new services and life to their community. So this is 1968, very shortly after the murder of Martin Luther King. And you have a Poor People's March on Washington, and you see Johnny Tillman, who's a welfare mother activist, migrant. She was a laundry worker who ended up in Los Angeles and ended up on public assistance when she too became too ill to work. And she created something called the National Welfare Rights Organization, together with George Wiley, who's a professor of chemistry and civil rights activist. And they said, how could poor women have any influence over this political system? How could they get anything? And their idea was, you got to apply some economic pressure. As Ruby said when she came to meet with Johnny Tillman, she said, you got to hit him in the pocketbook. Right? That's how you are going to have anybody pay attention to, she founded this group called, Needy Mothers Anonymous, because she said that's all we were. We were anonymous. No one could hear us. So Duncan, after the cutoff, here we have, all of these warehoused families in New York that are also looking for a way to have some influence over the political system. They're just dumped, homeless families just dumped in these horrifying tumble-down hotels. And all of them become really interested in a mother's movement. And that's what the welfare rights movement is. It's a mother's movement, right? It's this idea that, as Alversa Biel said, someone from the War on Poverty Community Action Program came to her door and said, you got to do something to better life for your kids. Or she remembers it, betterify life for your kids, which I love. And she said, yeah, I got it. This was the first time I'd heard the words welfare and rights in the same sentence. So I got it. We have rights. It's part of the civil rights struggle. We're going to do something for our kids. And you've got mothers across the country in 66, 67, 68 who decide to do this. So Duncan comes home from one of these meetings in D.C., and she flies into McCarran Airport in Las Vegas. And when you leave McCarran to go to the west side, the black neighborhood, you go right up the strip. And she just looked around and she said, this is the pocketbook. Right? If you can't make an impression here, that's pretty bad. So when everybody got cut off, she called to the National Welfare Rights Movement, and she had a really interesting idea. She got old civil rights activists. She calls them down to march on the Strip. They've decided they're going to shut down the Las Vegas Strip. They're going to do what hadn't been done. All those unions are great, but they had never had a strike because the promise was, we'll give you good conditions, we'll give you good wages. You strike us, somebody's going to end up face down in the desert, which is what happened to the founder of the union, Al Bramlett, a few years after this. So they didn't strike. So the courage to shut down the Strip was a tremendous thing. It really was. And Duncan was very smart, and like poor women before her had done, she thought, I got to have some famous faces, some affluent people marching with me. Otherwise, somebody's going to get shot. Along with Jane Fonda, Donald Sutherland, Dr. Spock, you have civil rights leader Ralph Abernathy, peace activist Dave Dallinger. You've got a lot of folks who come down and say, we're going to march with you. So they decide on March 6, 1971, to march down the Las Vegas Strip to demand their checks back. And you've got, Jane Fonda in the front of the march getting all the cameras and all the attention. But what they do, and this is where the book gets its name, is they literally march into Caesar's Palace, because they said Caesar's Palace is the icon of conspicuous consumption in the country at the time. It's got all this gold velvet, gold gilt-edged, banquettes and gold velvet tables, and they march in, and they're singing "We Are Into Caesar's Palace" and "We Shall Not Be Moved," singing labor civil rights songs, and the cameras love it. They're on the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times the next day, with these little skinny kids sticking their arms up over the tables holding signs that says, Nevada starves children. I have a picture of Nevada starves. Yeah, here they're addressing the marchers before the march. Johnny Tillman and Duncan. So we can find, this is actually a second march. They shut the Strip down for several weekends. There's Nevada starves children. And they get a great deal of attention. And their point is to question who's moral and who's immoral, right? Because these welfare mothers are always being called immoral. They're always being called cheats. They're always being called frauds. And so they thought, why don't we do this, in a state where gambling is legal and the state gets tax revenues off gambling. And they brought down white welfare mothers from the northern part of the state where prostitution is legal, who'd been told by caseworkers to, get a good tax-paying job and get some work in the Mustang Ranch brothel. And they wanted to talk about that. Again, mothers trying to take care of their kids. And it was really an amazing moment in American history, because these women got a sense of themselves as empowered, as righteous, and as critics of a welfare system that didn't work, and they really began to argue they could do it and do it better. So they went in federal court. They're reinstated, because at that moment, you've got a lot of, as part of the welfare rights movement and as part of the war on poverty, created the Legal Services Corporation to give legal aid to the poor. And you've got a lot of legal services attorneys who are trying very important cases for these poor mothers. They get rid of the man in the house rule. which allowed welfare caseworkers to, basically barge into women's houses in the middle of the night looking for men. Because any man could be, according to most state laws, a quote-unquote substitute father, financially responsible for the kids. So if a man was found in the house, they would be cut off welfare, even if it was just someone, passing through. They were able to overturn the man in the house rule, and in a rule called Goldberg versus Kelly, they were able to get a federal court decision that said, this is a right. You have a right to a hearing if they're about to cut you off. Right? Because people prior to 1970 had just been cut off of aid. That's it, you're done. And under the Social Security Act of 1935, Title IV makes it a right of the poorest citizens to get aid from the government. Now, in today's political climate, that very idea seems a stretch, and indeed the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, otherwise known as the End of Welfare as we know it, got rid of that right. It repealed Title IV of the Social Security Act. So it is no longer a right, but it was then. And so after they marched on the Strip, and they lobbied in state legislatures, and they sat in everywhere. There was no library in their neighborhood, so they had read-ins in whites-only libraries, right? They had eat-ins in the casinos because they were, kids were suffering the effects of long-term malnutrition in those days. That was not uncommon, right? When people say the war on poverty didn't work, there's hunger and insecurity. There's a lot of poverty in this country right now. There are people living in shocking and shameful conditions. It's not so common to see people with rickets and running sores and the kinds of malnutrition that was quite common in those years before food stamps. So they had eat-ins in the casinos. They had all this civil disobedience, and the governor chastised them one day when they came to the governor's house to lobby. The Democratic governor in northern Nevada, he said, "You guys should learn the system. You should stop running wild in the streets, and you guys should learn the system." So they did. They formed a group called Operation Life, and they began to apply for every war on poverty program they could find. The first and the most crucial were medical programs, because in 1971 there was no clinic on the black side of Las Vegas. There was no medical facility. They had to take 3 buses, travel hours to get to Sunrise Hospital, which was the only one that would treat them, and which was founded with pension fund money from the Teamsters, and was a good laundering opportunity for Jimmy Hoffa. Anyway, they found something really interesting. They couldn't get anyone to open a clinic. They couldn't get hired on to do any of the kind of screening programs that the federal poverty money made possible in Sunrise Hospital. So they decided, we'll do it ourselves. They got some idealistic med students and doctors and public health nurses and the women themselves to begin working these clinics, and they opened the first medical facility in their neighborhood. And they were dealing with very serious stuff. They were dealing with sickle cell. They were dealing with cancers and incipient cancers from all the exposure to fallout. They were dealing with some very serious stuff, and they had kids who had never seen a dentist come in. They had kids who had never seen an optometrist, so who were trying to go to school hungry, with messed up teeth and gums, and unable to see properly. And what they did was they rehabbed an old hotel that had been, when Las Vegas was still segregated until 1965. It was the place where the black stars who were so important in making Vegas famous, Nat King Cole, Lena Horne, Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte, would go and jam on the segregated side, because they couldn't stay on the west side. They couldn't stay on the Strip. It was segregated. So till 65, they would stay in this old hotel, the Cove. It was abandoned after desegregation, and they rehabbed it, these women and their kids, and their husbands and their friends, and they opened this first medical clinic. That's Alversa Beals, very excited. Now, these few cars are very important, because one of the programs they brought in, one of the War on Poverty programs, they brought in 2 very key programs. One was a program for which poor mothers across the country had lobbied, and the federal funding for it was not released until poor mothers sued, including Alversa Beals. She's one of the top names on the list of the suit that releases federal funds for the Women and Infant Children Nutrition Program. The program had been pushed through Congress by Hubert Humphrey, but once passed, the funding for it was never released. So these folks sued with the help of legal services and some poor mothers and kids across the country. And the Women and Infant Children program came in. And one of the things that did was it provided some money for women to be screeners, for poor people to be screeners. Now, some of these women could do it, some of them couldn't. Their daughters had generally gone through high school. Versie Beals had a 6th grade education. Ruby Duncan had made it to the 9th grade. She had a more sophisticated education. Their daughters, generally speaking, and their sons had gone to high school, and so some of them were able to do these WIC screening jobs. But the WIC clinic becomes a source of employment. They also got a program called Early Periodic Screening and Diagnostic Testing, which was a great war on poverty program that said if you bring in a kid and this kid screens for disease under this program, they'll be treated for free. So they brought in early periodic screening and diagnostic testing to the Operation Life project in the Old Cove Hotel. And one of the things they found screening these little kids was that they could actually save lives through treating sickle cell, through treating some of the diseases that came in. And Paul Starr, who's a Princeton health analyst, has this remarkable study where he shows that these clinics, of various kinds all over the country during the war on poverty, literally increased life expectancy in poor neighborhoods. People literally started living longer as a result of these community health centers. So when somebody tells you what a sham the war on poverty was, right, how corrupt it was and what a sham it was, that's one answer. Right? Another answer, if you take this program writ large, is that it cut child poverty in half in 10 years across the country. So it's a very, very powerful program. These folks are volunteers, volunteer doctors and nurses. The Public Health Service began to send medical school and nursing school graduates out to some of these community health centers, and they would forgive their loans. And you can there's still some of these kinds of programs. But the difference that's really powerful and important is this is run by poor women. It's their clinic, right? They're the staff. They apply for the funds, and they go out and they bring in these poor kids. This is the pickup brigade. Okay? Dorothy Jean Poole, Mary Wesley, Essie Henderson, Versie Beals. And they're going around in the station wagon all over the desert, all over the state of Nevada. Their little clinic screens the highest percentage of eligible children of any federally funded pediatric clinic in the country. It comes to the attention of Caspar Weinberger, no great fan of community organizations and protest, and he says, "How'd you do it? This is amazing. Why can't other clinics do it?" And they said, "It's pretty simple. We care about these kids. We think of them as being like our kids." And so when Ruby was asked in an interview around that time, we're in the late 70s now, what was her political philosophy, she said, "It's really simple. What I want for my own kids, I want for all kids." She said, "If you run the country that way, it'll be a lot better, a lot more humane, and a lot less poverty." So, and the great thing about it is that these women had all been on public assistance. They got a small amount of money. These were jobs. Right? They got a small amount of money to go out all over the state and get these poor kids and bring them in to be screened and make them healthier. Is that a waste of money? Is that corruption? Well, when Reagan's elected in 1980, there's some who argue that it is. It's corruption. What are you doing giving all these... By the late 1970s, Operation Life had also, they had funding for 100 CETA jobs, so they could hire poor kids in their community to do things like solarize houses, right? Put in burglar alarm systems and better locks so people were safe from crime. All kinds of rehab work. Ran a community newspaper, right? Ran nutrition programs for kids, young, especially for teen mothers and fathers, to give them a sense of what to feed their kids. Ran a child care center, ran drug rehab. It was pretty amazing. And all of these were jobs. By 1978, Operation Life was the biggest employer in that little neighborhood of chronically underemployed people. So again, when you have the shift of administration in 1980, you got Reagan's officials, including George Miller, who becomes an HHS regional commissioner for Western District 9, California and Nevada. And they say, God, what are you doing passing millions of dollars of federal funds through the hands of women like these with their elementary school educations? That's got to be corruption. That's got to be wrong. And so what happens to this group happens to community organizations funded by the War on Poverty all across the country, especially groups that were run by women of color and run by women, period. And they're dragged into court for fraud. Now, very few of these cases result in fraud convictions. Okay, some of them do. There's corruption in this as in all things. There are corrupt people in this as in all things. But in the end, it drains energy. People become exhausted. People become sick. Ruby collapsed at one point being dragged out of court, and the federal funds are frozen during this period. And slowly but surely, by the time I met these women in 1992, the funding had just been finally pulled. So this clinic that they were running has been rebuilt, and it's a beautiful clinic. And the library that they founded, personally collecting 10,000 books for their neighborhood, has been rebuilt. It's a beautiful modern building. Like this one, even bigger. It's got a performing arts center, but they don't run it. Poor people don't run it anymore. And that's the question that I spoke to them about. I said, what did it feel like to walk into these institutions when they were run by poor women themselves? And they said it was amazing. They didn't look down to us. They didn't talk down to us. And they also became models for what you could do. Versie Beals would say poverty is so depressing. She'd come in and find these women so depressed and say, look, if I could get my kids out of the house, if I could do it, you could do it. Right? And they'd take these kids down to be treated. And they were dealing with, their mental health issues and their self-esteem. And this picture did not come out so good, I apologize, but the faceless man in the middle is Jimmy Carter, who in 1976 comes to Las Vegas and says, this program is pretty amazing, and invites Ruby Duncan to Washington, where she and some other community activists who are brought to Washington during the Carter years consult on CETA legislation, the second round of CETA legislation, in which gave federal money to community groups to create jobs, the Youth Employment Training Program, which was a fairly large public works, public jobs program as well, training for single mothers in trades that had been traditionally male. It's a very interesting moment. Again, not something we think of, particularly when we think of the Carters, but a very interesting moment in Washington that kind of it doesn't completely disappear in the 1980s, but certainly public jobs programs, that's what I want to come back to, do disappear. One of the interesting things that Ruby's able to do in Washington, here she's lobbying with Coretta Scott King for a full employment bill, Humphrey Hawkins bill, which passed in 1976. One of the things that these folks are arguing is that full employment's a right? That government subsidies to the economy are a right. Everybody wants to work. Nobody wants to be, well, as Ruby said, welfare is a great, it's a great lifestyle, like they say. She said, if you're dead, it's not a great lifestyle to live on. You can't, because you can't. So they were lobbying for all kinds of public employment. And interestingly, welfare mothers in the movement got into this really big fight with Senator Russell Long of Louisiana, who called them broodmares and said they just had babies to get more money on welfare. And they would do these attempts to speak in the Senate that they called broodmare stampedes, was their protests. And, but what was interesting is that over the years, Duncan and Huey Long came to an agreement. Huey Long, not Huey Long, Russell Long, excuse me. Huey Long was his father, the great share our wealth populist demagogue of the 30s. But Russell Long came up with the template for the Earned Income Tax Credit. And the Earned Income Tax Credit is kind of a negative income tax, right? It's supposed to benefit the working poor, right? So he liked it because it encouraged work. Conservatives liked it because it encouraged work. It has become the single most successful income transfer program lifting people out of poverty after Social Security. Very, very important. But the original conception was with a massive public jobs program. Very, very much like Russell Long's father did in Louisiana, and a la, Roosevelt's Work Progress Administration, Public Works Administration. Carter tried to enact it in the late 70s. Since that time, that idea has died. And that's an idea that, in talking to reporters and policy people today for the 50th anniversary, is once again maybe starting to come up, this idea of public works and public jobs. But something to discuss for today, whether or not that's a good possibility. This is the Ruby Duncan Manor housing project that they built in the neighborhood. They built a lot of affordable housing for the poor. What's interesting is that HUD and housing, public housing, is always seen as subject to most corruption during the war on poverty. The programs run by poor people themselves, self-help legal assistance and housing assistance in Baltimore, Ruby Duncan Manor, some of the housing projects in Raleigh-Durham had almost no incidents of corruption because people wanted them to live in. Right? They needed them to live in, they wanted them to live in. If you keep them in the community, people can take care of them. Here you've got a little sense of this is a women's organization by and large. They're not exclusively black and white women. Very much a beloved community into the 1980s. Working on alternative energy. Here they are in the 90s. Actually, this is all early 2000s. Still friends, still love each other. The beloved community lives on, which is really great. In 2011, a group of poor students in Vegas, very integrated group, Mexican, Native American, black, white, Asian, got together to try to get a school named for Ruby, and they opened Ruby Duncan Elementary School in 2011. And one of the really cool things about it is this idea that, again, that poor kids needed to see work done by poor people themselves, and so the school is full of exhibits about their lives, these women's lives and their movement, and all the things that are possible. Another picture of folks now, a lot of these people, a lot of their daughters, some of their kids did incredibly well. Woman on the end, Sandra, is Ruby Duncan's daughter. She's a lawyer and a school activist in DC. Some of them did very well, some of them didn't. Crack came through the neighborhood as Mary Wesley Seated ended up raising 19 grandchildren. So the story is not entirely a happy ending, but here we can go back to the nice picture of 17-year-old Ruby. Oh well, never mind. There you go. So what I wanted to talk about now and open it up to you is this question of this idea of poor people running their own programs from the bottom up with public funding and private funding as well through these community development corporations, public jobs programs, all of this. Do you see it working now? Do you see it as a plan? Supposedly Barack Obama in his State of the Union is going to talk about increasing inequality. Whether there will be solutions, I don't know. I said in the book, he sent me a thank you note, so he's got it. Whether he ever read it, I have no idea. He did meet Ruby Duncan, though. What do you think? What do you think about this model? Oh, yes, there's a mic back there. What about poor women running the world, poor people running their own programs? Yeah.
Well, perhaps the key question is, it seems that Operation Life did not survive. How did it die?
Funding, it survived for quite a long time. It survived for 20 years. And in that time did a tremendous amount of good. It died ultimately because the funding was withdrawn from them, and some of the contracts for federal programs were given to more professional kinds of organizations. That was the argument. In the end, they couldn't prove any kind of fraud. But the argument ultimately that got them defunded and got the money transferred to to more professional groups was that they were not educated. They weren't qualified. And so ultimately this question of qualifications came into play. Yeah.
That's what I wanted to ask, is the sophisticated structure, or where did the sophisticated infrastructure come from?
Well, there are two things.
How did it work in terms of infrastructure?
How it worked was really interesting. I mean, on the one hand, you had to have an alliance, obviously. And so, as Ruby said, if I could write, I would be really dangerous, but I can't. And so what happened is they inspired people. And so you saw one of the young white women you saw in that picture was a lawyer who came in with Vista Volunteers and then went to law school. There were a couple of lawyers, one of whom is a judge now in Vegas, who worked with them for years, helping them to write these proposals and frame these grants. Eventually, as their kids were educated, some of them were able to work for the organization. But you needed a cross-class alliance to make it work. And it was long after 1964 and the Freedom Summer, it was a beloved community. As I said, when Duncan's School opened in 2011, everybody came in. They've stayed in touch, they've stayed close. But what's interesting is when the WIC program was investigated for fraud, it was these women who were keeping the books, and they found that they had come up with a system that was accurate down to a few pennies. They came up with something they could do. They said, we manage our household budgets. We can do it, and they did. So it was a combination of the help of some very sophisticated people, but the people whose motto was, as their most important legal ally, Jack Anderson, told me, that we were on tap, not on top. We were resources. We weren't running the show. But again, they also came up with systems that they could manage themselves. As Mary Wesley put it, she said, we were smart enough to bring the programs in, but then when, all of a sudden we were too dumb to run them. They'd been running them, and as I mentioned that one statistic, they've been running them pretty successfully. And, community, and does it always work? Will it always work now? I don't know, but it works so well, and they're not the only story like this from the War on Poverty years. You can find stories of black and white women who worked together and opened a clinic in Raleigh, North Carolina. In Durham, North Carolina, when it was still segregated. You can find stories of clinics opened up on the Sioux Reservation by a woman by the name of Madonna Thunderhawk. Another similar clinic opened in Minnesota by Lorelei DeCaro, both American Indian Movement activists with War on Poverty dollars. It's not the only story like this, so I do want to emphasize that. I know this one the best, but it's not the only one. Yeah.
I noticed that there's quite an emphasis in your talk on the rural programs and startup. And do they run into different problems in urban clinics, urban and do in rural?
You want he said, rural, there wasn't a lot of emphasis in the talk on rural programs, and that rural programs run into different problems than urban ones did. And I think that's true. And in the collection that I co-edited a couple of years ago, called The War on Poverty, A New Grassroots History, a lot of scholars contributed, and a number of them did talk about some rural programs, some programs in Kentucky, some programs in Oklahoma, in native areas in Mississippi, and I think that there definitely were different problems in terms of people being able to get to the clinics, people not having cars, people not having telephones. There were different issues that needed to be dealt with in rural programs, but there were rural programs established, that were quite successful. Oklahoma Indians for Opportunity, the OIO, right, which was funded in part by the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity in Washington, established clinics all across the Cherokee region, and it was kind of interesting because they actually thought they were establishing, solely for Cherokee, and they realized that with War on Poverty money, they had to be building programs together with various kinds of groups. The Operation Life Clinic ultimately became incredibly multicultural. Mexican, Asian, Native, it became a very multicultural place. For traditional Cherokee involved in starting this, they were a little resistant to that, but they did ultimately come around, especially cultural preservation had been such an important part of what they were trying to do. That they didn't necessarily want to have a multicultural approach at first, but they did. So I agree with you, and I think poverty issues in this, in this region, for example, and in other rural areas, have a whole different set of problems. But I'm not convinced that this basic idea that that poor folks might be able to run them better and understand what they need better with the help of people, with more resources. But anyway, that's obviously my belief. But I want to open it up to you. I'm still talking too much. Yes.
It seems to me that funding is going to be an important question. And where's the funding going to come from to do these? Given the present climate in Washington, it seems unlikely that we're going to get much funding from the federal government. So we need to look for other sources, either local governments or philanthropic foundations who take it upon themselves to fund these things. How likely is that to happen?
Well, part of what happened as federal funds got cut is that some private foundations stepped in. Ford stepped in. The Low Income Strategies Corporation pulled together a lot of LISC, pulled together a lot of different groups, and so enterprise. There is private funding that helps to fund community development corporations around the country. But one of the interesting things is there is still federal funding. Despite all the rhetoric about what a failure the war on poverty is, Richard Nixon expanded it tremendously. Public housing, food stamps, minority business programs. I mean, Richard Nixon actually expanded it as much as Johnson did in many ways. He didn't shape the legislation. So there's a really interesting thing going on, which is there's all this rhetoric of how the war on poverty is a total failure and we have to leave it behind. But Republican as well as Democratic presidents have expanded it. George Bush made the single biggest expansion of food stamps since the Johnson years in 2008, just before he left office, because it was needed. So there is money, right? The question is, it's been cut, it's been shifted around, it's certainly been taken out of the hands of poor people themselves. But there is federal money, there is private money, and there is some state and local money as well. Just a question of where it goes. One of the nice things, and there are very few nice things about the 1996 welfare reform, is that it really created 50 different programs. And so there are possibilities within states, and certainly, in a state like this, which has got a lot of relatively progressive people in the state capital, there are possibilities within states to do local kinds of programs like this. And you're beginning to get some interesting community action programs developing. And I don't know. I mean, there's one in Bradford near me, but I don't know how much it's happening in Vermont. But certainly you're starting to get that in New York again in ways that haven't been seen in a long time. Thoughts? Yeah.
I have a question, honey. And it just concerns me because I am a Southerner, and I have been there, and I understand everything that's going on in the South. And since I've been here for the past 3 months, and you can sit here, and you can skip around what you want to say about, this and that. My main concern is really our homeless people and the people in general. What do we got going on here? For real. Do you have one thing to say that's going to help anybody in this audience about what is going on here?
Here in Vermont, in Brattleboro.
Would you repeat after me?
Here and everybody else. I'm sorry, honey, did you not hear me?
Nothing.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's like we have a lot of homeless people. I've only been here 3 months, and I am from the South, if you cannot tell. Love y'all. Thank you anyway. But I am seeing like a lot of issues, and people want to like tiptoe around everything that's going on here. Now you can say this happened and that happened, but what are we doing in general for the people here, today, now? What's happening here? I mean, is there anything that we can do that would like join hands? Because it's a homeless population, and it is not just the women, but there are men out there too. I mean, there's a lot of people out here. And in 3 months, I have noticed that I've been here. This is a sad situation. What can we do to overcome this problem?
You're right. People got to work together, try to bring in some of this funding, local funding, shelters, but more than shelters, obviously.
Well, we need a lot. For real.
Oh, you're,
not just, I understand your topic was the women in poverty, but there is poverty everywhere. I mean,
you're right.
Yes,
You're
poverty
absolutely
is
right.
everywhere. What can we do as a community? And like I said, I've only been here 3 months, and I love y'all. I think you are the greatest people in the world. Remind me of where I'm from. But what can we do to get and pull each other together? Pull each other together.
Pull each other together.
Yes. What can we do? I mean, anybody out here got some ideas?
Yeah, go ahead.
We had an opportunity to have some poverty circles recently, like say maybe in the last 3 or 4 or 5 years, where we actually got the community together, and we actually had factors of all sorts of community nonprofits. We had churches, we had individuals, we had organizations. We came together to help eradicate some of this poverty issues. It is a massively difficult thing to do. We've had some key people who have unfortunately not been able to do exactly what needed to be done. And the unfortunate thing is, as hard as we try, Vermont is one of the best places to be homeless in, I gotta tell you, honestly.
It's so cold.
Yes, because we do have shelters, and we do have meals here on a daily basis that you can access for free. So we are chipping away at it, and we're doing the best we can. It is unfortunate that we can't do it as fast as the need is. That's the unfortunate thing.
Everybody is scared out here, I'm saying. They're scared of the homeless. And that's what I'm saying. They're afraid of the homeless, and that really irritates me. What can we do to get them where they're not afraid of them? They're not scary people. They're alone. They're scared. And there's a lot. What I've seen in 3 months has really irritated me. I'm not going to say what I want to say but I'm going to say it irritates me because you know what? It irritates me to see the way they're treated. Everybody wants to shun them away.
It's fascinating you say that, because a couple of years ago I was on the advisory board for the state PATH, which oversees the welfare interactions with clients as well as the caseworkers, and they particularly tried to emphasize the empathy and the recognition
All right, honey,
of humans.
Let me tell you what I've seen as far as some of these caseworkers go. They do not empathize, they do not go, and they do not care about what's going on with them. They let them slide through the cracks. What are we going to do to get them beyond where they need to go? Don't treat them like, I'm sorry, I've got a cold. It's just, what are we going to do to get people beyond this fact to realize they're here, they're real?
Well,
What are we going to do to let everybody know they're real people?
one of the difficulties is in actually
Okay, well,
getting.
we're going to sit here and we're going to talk like, we're Reagan, or, we're like President Obama. Okay, I'm talking real people.
I'm talking real people. I came
Okay.
to Vermont
Explain
with
to me.
3 beautiful children with a deadbeat dad who never paid a dime in child support, who forced us into poverty. All
right.
So I'm no different than you. I bleed the same color blood. I understand the same exact issues that you're dealing with, exact same issues. I see it at work. I see it in our community.
6 grandkids.
I'd like to draw this, excuse me.
But we do have facilities.
What?
We do have them here in Brattleboro that can help you.
These are
I
very,
mean, it's not that I don't want to work. I love to work. Work is, it's not just
I'm sorry.
people in general.
I'm sorry. I understand what you're saying, but we need to move this discussion on
right.
into the topic. Thank you, Bud. Thank you for your comments.
Yeah,
And let's see do we have some other questions?
All right.
right back there.
Hi, I do think from a local standpoint, there is an opportunity. There's an organization called Turning Point that is, it works with folks in recovery, and it's sort of a community center where people that are recovering from addictions can go, and they're working on that. They've just bought a property downtown, close to downtown, and they want to become sort of a community center and do something, you know, they work with a lot of impoverished groups, they work with a lot of different populations. And I do think that there's an opportunity in this community to create something there, which could be, you know, some sort of model, because it is based on people doing for themselves.
Okay.
And it is something that I think could be an opportunity in this community, particularly after the governor's speech today. And
I was
the fact
just
that he's
thinking that. There's more
talking about
funding
putting
for
money
that kind of
towards
Well,
stuff.
that.
you're talking to the point, what about for the people that don't need it though?
So I think from your perspective, is that, I agree with you that I have the opinion that grassroots is best, and people, you know, people working and in their own communities and know what they need, and that's the only way really you can grow a movement. And I'm really appreciative of the talk that you had today, because I think it's really inspirational.
Thank you, thank you. And I think it's one way to make poor people able to not only contribute to the change, but also to appear in their full humanness and not be objectified, which is part of the problem with so much anti-poverty work. So that organization sounds great. I hope there's more money after today's speech, because there does need to be government money. It isn't all going to come from private money. It can't. It can't. I mean, it could, but it won't. It ought to. Yes.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Thank you.
Okay, so just, I was glad to hear you speaking about the NWRO women, because to me they're heroes, and I'm wondering, I mean, I've seen, one of the things they were genius at was telling the story and kind of flipping all of that demonization of poor women and turning it, you know, I've seen there's a collection at the Sophia Smith collection at Smith has their papers, and there's just some wonderful material that they put out of, you know, posters, wanted posters of Wilbur Mills, and certificates honoring Ronald Reagan for as the #1 welfare recipient in the state of California. Really interesting media stuff. And I'm wondering if there is a comparable, any groups working on that level today?
You know, there are quite a few, and they get very little coverage. For example, I don't know if there was a protest in Vermont at that time. I don't think there was, but there were Have a Heart protests by welfare rights, you know, mothers and children's groups at the time of the 1996 welfare reform bill in state capitals across the country. Almost no media coverage. Sherry Hankala's Kensington Welfare Rights Union in Philadelphia has been really interesting, because they got local unions to take welfare recipients in so they could become union members, because one of the things that the work experience programs that were passed after the welfare reform bill did was it broke unions in public hospitals, in sanitation work, and a lot of different kinds of jobs that these women were put to work doing, supposedly to get work experience. But anyway, so Hankala got these folks got the unions to organize these women, and one of the things they also did is they protested at the UN, making it a human rights issue, and they occupied abandoned Catholic churches and schools around the city of Philadelphia as shelters for the homeless, brought people inside. So there are some pretty ingenious organizers operating in the more recent period. I don't know what Hankala is doing now, but certainly, you know, 10 or so years ago, there were still important people. And there are some welfare rights groups. If you go on the web, they do communicate with each other, and there's a certain amount of organizing taking place on the web. And some of the kinds of stuff that women did door to door, like sharing what your legal rights are, and you know what happens when you go in to meet with a caseworker, and what happens when they cut you off. God. Anyway, some of that stuff is going on the web, which is kind of interesting.
Could I ask,
Bring it up to you.
do most of these groupings, do they start with one or two strong personalities, and is that the thing that is most important?
I think there were two things. One, they start absolutely with strong personalities. When I write about, women housewife organizers in the 30s protesting evictions, one of the women I wrote about was described by another person I interviewed as a spark plug, right? And certainly Ruby Duncan was a spark plug. And Johnny Tillman and Beulah Sanders in New York, and a lot of these women were spark plugs. But I'm sure there are these spark plugs out there now. What there is not now is a sense that anybody is standing up and saying we have a moral imperative to do something about poverty, and there's very little discussion of what kinds of programs are available to people, so they don't have a sense of rights. I think really strong thing that Mary Wesley talked to me about is the moment when you lose shame, right? When you start to think of yourself as someone who's worked hard and has a right to sort of a basic subsistence, and there's no collective feeling that there should be a floor, below which we shouldn't allow any American citizen to fall, right? So I think it's a different time, and Occupy Wall Street protesters did a great job, I think, of calling attention a couple of years ago to these issues. But we'll see. We'll see. Supposedly the president's going to do it in a State of the Union speech. We'll see.
From your perspective, have you been much involved with the food justice movement as a locus of organizing, as a place where people from all over are crossing paths and opportunities to build equal partnerships? From your perspective, what's going on with that? Do you see a lot of hope there? Do you see what are some examples that stand out?
I don't know a great deal now. And actually, it sounds like you do, so I'd love to know some more of what you're talking about. The mic's got to come back, yeah? I think, at the moment, hunger, these women did a tremendous amount across the country to not only politicize hunger, but to address it. And suing for the food stamp program, which took lawsuits at 17 states by women like these, and making sure that people had access to food stamps is, a gift to all of us to this day, because, as I said, I think it's 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 Americans now who is getting their food through food stamps. It is the single most essential thing we have in terms of lessening the suffering of the post-2008 recession. So what happened then was tremendous, and I know that some of the people in Washington, Ronnie Pollock, for example, who was one of the key people in publicizing food issues, is still active, and he's working more with healthcare for the elderly now. And I'm sure there are activists right now doing inspiring things, and I was hoping you were going to tell me more.
Sure. As far as specific things in our community, I can see faces around the room and handing me a mic that have been involved in getting food to people and getting the word out and educating everything from food stamps are a federal source of dollars, that it's no source of shame to take them because you're bringing those dollars into your community.
That's right.
Everything from that to growing the food to getting it on the trucks to winter farmers market to legislation to
Buying clubs, just buying clubs.
Yeah, the buying clubs in the school. So it's easier for the parents to pick them up when they come and pick the kid up. You can pick up your market share. New farmers get an opportunity to grow and practice on a small market. Calibrate their shares. Families can pick it up. They're able to have a lower price point because of the scale of it. They go through Wyndham Farm and Food, which gets it from the farms into the cafeterias. There's that's local pictures of it, and joining too the conversations with food banks and emergency food stores, joining that up with what maybe was a place with more money and resources of school gardening and organic, and those conversations starting to come together. Kind of in a similar way of environmental justice. This is a place where we live, and we should say how it operates. And a similar ethos, we are partners with everybody eats, everybody lives here.
I would love to have you come up to Thetford and talk there, because no, I mean, the school is growing and the food banks exist, and, but I don't think there's that kind of conversation. So before we leave, give me it'd be great to come up and do that, because the need is certainly there. I don't think those conversations are taking place in partnerships in the same way. This is why I love doing these.
I was wondering if you could talk more about the Personal Responsibility Act and how that helped. My sense of the Personal Responsibility Act was that it individualized aid and welfare and public assistance programs more. Before, there were like outreach workers who would go and gather the women, and they would have meetings and consciousness rating meetings, and that all went away and started. Now it's more like you meet individually with your caseworkers. My sense, there's not as many group workers, groups of women talking together, and I got the feeling that these women, they were working together, and they were a threat, and the system perceived them as a threat, and that's one of the things they did, was to break people apart or isolate people in their recipient in receiving the aid. So if the procedure could go back to more of having more people meeting together, aid recipients meeting together, and things like that. I don't know, that's just one thing that I saw in community action groups, women meeting, and there was a CABA, there was a community action house here in Brattleboro years ago, and they'd have food, they had a food shelf was there was clothing giving out there, legal aid would come and meet with people there, battered women's group started there, and all that went away after Reagan started cutting, and then Clinton, put the death to it.
No, I mean, I think what you're describing is very similar to the kind of thing that I described here, and I think that was all over the country. I think one of the things that happened after the Personal Responsibility Act is that states were judged successes or failures based on how many people they cut from the rolls, not how many people they got out of poverty. Right? That became the only measure of success, and indeed there were sanctions levied against the states if they didn't cut enough people from the rolls. So I think that's one part of it. But I also think one of the things that happened is under Clinton, the Hope 6 program came in, and there was an attempt to literally blow up a lot of public housing projects and give people vouchers to move into Section 8 housing in more middle-class neighborhoods. And while individually that improved some people's lives, it did break down the sense of community. Because a lot of this organizing took place in the Marble Manor public housing project. And if you look in Baltimore and a lot of New York and different places, LA, where the community was strong, and it sounds like you had that here too, some of it was in those projects where people lived together. Again, it's something we only talk about how they failed, but we don't talk about the sense of community that was sometimes there. So, and the other thing, finally, is that TANF and Personal Responsibility Act put a 2-year, a 2-year consecutive maximum and a 5-year lifetime maximum on receiving aid. So in terms of learning the system and being on it long enough to develop some kind of identity, it doesn't happen to the same degree anymore. So I think you're absolutely right. People are much more isolated, and I'm not sure how to reach out. It seems like you guys in this community do a pretty good job of it. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great.